who are gathering together. Usually, many are being organized. Well, I did a little researching, and the first things that came up were invitations from Tea Party affiliates to get people into civic observation of the election. So there's a fear in the United States that domestic observers organized to protect us from vote fraud are actually there to intimidate voters in systematic patterns, to disenfranchise people who might feel shaky about their right to vote, or might feel unsure that they are in the right place or that they are doing it right, but may legitimately have a right to vote. So I didn't think I would have a wireless link to play you the story, but I encourage you to go to npr.org and look for this story on how efforts to prevent voter fraud here are drawing scrutiny. You know, the other thing that has been in the news recently that has me thinking about this research is a lot of discussion about the benefits of early voting. Now, some people say early voting is a great idea because it gives the opportunity for more people to participate. But just, I believe it was it yesterday or over the weekend, I read an article by a couple of political scientists, an opinion piece, they're from the University of Wisconsin, arguing that early voting, in fact, reduces turnout. It reduces the net number of people who turn out, rather than making it more accessible. And their theory is it reduces turnout because we're not all going together. We're not all standing there in a line. We're not going to see our neighbors, and they're not going to see us. It takes the social pressure and the social rewards out of the equation. So I think that I need to think a little bit more about how the issues that arise for domestic observation at home resonate with what I'm finding in the context of Mexico and some of my other cases. But I'm really looking forward to your comments and your questions and your suggestions for how I can continue to move this project forward. So thank you very much. And
one of the ways I think you might be able to think about the social capital, because I was particularly struck by the graph that you showed the decline, but I wasn't surprised at all.
yeah.
It might be that many of those people who had participated in 1994 actually gained that social capital, but then they took it to other types of civil society organizations at the more local level, with the argument that it's not procedural democracy is only part of the definition of democracy, and that, at least what I've seen in my research, people say, okay, but what's the quality, the social conditions, the economic conditions that are happening? And so it might be because Alianza Cívica has done such a great job of electoral monitoring, people are now saying, I'm going to take all these skills that I've gained and this knowledge, and I'm going to put it to good use in my local organizations to try to improve my local conditions that still are terrible. I don't know, you probably don't have the data for that, but that might be somewhere where, in your future development of projects, adding on. But that might be one way to tap into getting a more precise answer.
Yeah, I've been thinking more and more. I've been thinking that I'd love to have life histories of an appropriate sample of activists. So, in all my abundant free time, I can get right on that. But I think that that's how I would find out. Now that I've sort of honed in on this, and I think that's a really good, point, because it connects to the experience that 20,000 volunteers had in 1994, where they worked their hardest and they still weren't able to. One of the conundrums for monitoring, period, is that the monitoring that you do in any given period doesn't have an impact then, by definition of the nature of monitoring. You're observing and reporting, but you're not correcting. Monitors are usually legally restricted and or restricted by the organizations that they work for from actually stepping in. So I can watch somebody telling somebody else how to vote when I'm observing elections, but I'm actually not authorized to go and say, yeah, you really shouldn't do that. That's not nice. So the impact isn't until further down the line. So all those 20,000 in 1994 who hoped they were going to have an immediate impact may have said, well, what we really need to do is this in our communities to level the playing field.
Yeah. Take a look at Doug McAdams' work. Freedom Summer, It's a great read. It's actually a really good read. It's intended to, it's sort of beach reading for academics. But he looked at the life stories of people that participated in Mississippi Freedom and the electoral monitoring elections in Mississippi in 1961, I believe, and what happened to them afterwards in terms of participating in other types of social movements and organizations.
Good question? Yeah. I mean, other than the fact you reminded me to vote early and vote often.
This was a well-scheduled talk. Huh? You guys feeling the pressure?
But what keeps these DMOs pure, if you will, over time? I mean, they seem like they play a role that's significant, that you'd be well likely to want to buy off, pressure off, threaten off, or whatever. Is it the methodology that they use that's subject to scrutiny, so that it makes it more difficult to cheat?
Well, if I'm getting your question right, you're wondering, how come they don't get co-opted by the system? Is that right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and they don't work perfectly everywhere. But in Mexico, for example, groups that tend to have, first of all, I should say that when most people observed these groups started to get involved in elections, as with international election observation, the idea was that maybe the first 1, 2, maybe 3 elections after a transition would be observed, and then after that, people wouldn't see the need, or political parties would take on their responsible roles of, watching over each other's conduct in a civil way. But that has really not happened. If you look at election observing in the world, it is continually on the rise. Now, over 90% of elections held anywhere are monitored. And my data on Latin America shows that although international interest has declined in the region, domestic observation is continuing on that upward trend. So your question is especially good, considering the fact that they're hanging around for a long period of time. And the main answer is that the way these organizations, their currency, their power comes from what Keck and Sicken call information politics. And so they don't have the power of the purse. They don't have economic leverage. They don't have leverage of force accessible to them. These are civil society groups. So what they have to do is channel the power of information. And they are only as powerful as their information is credible. So basically, groups that have longevity and not some, surreptitious force underwriting them, in order to have the credibility that is required for them to continue to gain resources. Now, most of them have diversified their funding, but they are also mostly funded by international sources. They basically have to do good work, but that's part of what forces them into this effort to, be increasingly technical and neutral, in everything they do. Even when, Mexico now gets, the Mexican group gets a lot of funding from different agencies of the government. There's an agency for citizen participation now that's been created in the newly democratizing structure of the state that funds some of the work that they do. Sometimes they get funding from the Election Institute to work on specific aspects of bringing citizens into election reform processes. But all of that support, their continued existence basically rests on their credibility. So it's an interesting trade-off. That said, there are some groups that are completely partisan and corrupt, but those groups are pretty obvious because their funding, belies their loyalties. It's a good question. Michael?
Has there been like a tension between going to this more highly technical, less populist, I guess you would say, or like within the organization itself? Like, has there been factions that want to remain more of a social movement than completing the goal that they set out in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. There absolutely has been tension. I mean, it's led to sort of a vacillating selection of executive directors over the years, and also to taking on some projects that don't look very coherent in the overall portfolio of the organization. So one of their most recent projects that I